going to ask the panel to come up in a moment, but just before I do, I want to say what a pleasure it is to be here and a privilege. And like Jim, I'm actually very proud of UKERC reaching its 20th anniversary, although I haven't been directly involved in the research. But also it's quite a nostalgic event for me because I was recruited to be Director General of Energy in the then DTI in 2002, and my main task was to deliver the Energy White Paper of 2003, which is the one Jim mentioned that helped in the gestation of UKERC. Now, that white paper set out among the goals of energy policy, and it was the first one, to put ourselves on a path to cut CO2 emissions 60% by 2050, following on from a recommendation of the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution, with real progress by 2020. And there was a big debate, particularly with the Treasury, about whether that should be the first goal. And the Prime Minister and the then Secretary of State, Patricia Hewitt, Prime Minister Tony Blair, insisted. And I think it was probably the first for any of the advanced economies to put climate change at the heart of its energy policy as long ago as 2003. And of course, we had the related goals of reliability, affordability, and the use of competitive markets to support growth, economic growth and productivity. But you know, when I went round internationally explaining the main themes of the white paper, I met incredulity. I mean, I can remember sitting in the White House in Washington and them just kind of, what? And one of the things they said to me was, you know, you really think, this is 2004, you really think in January the European countries are going to come together and have that carbon trading scheme? And I said, yes, I was with the staffers from both the President's, Vice President's office and the DOE. And then I went to Japan in 2005, 2006, can't remember. And it was, I spoke to their equivalent of the CBI, the Kaidanren. And I was the only woman in the room, apart from my interpreter. And the chap from the embassy afterwards said to me, he was, you know, that he, the interpreter was translating me into Japanese. He was sharing briefing with me if someone was asking a question. He said, I didn't translate it to you, but they were mocking. They were mocking the idea that we would reach 10% of renewable capacity by 2010. Now, we didn't do that, but we did a few years later. Anyway, that's just by way of general background, and I'm glad that those goals have not only survived, but really strengthened. But there was one sentence I wanted to read out, which was in the white paper: there would be a new UK Energy Research Centre to play a key role in coordinating research, facilitating collaboration with industry, and UK participation in international projects, to be a centre of excellence in its own right, and to attract high calibre researchers and graduates. Well, I think that UKERC has, you know, amply delivered on those goals. But again, there was another disagreement going on in government at the time. One or two people, some quite influential, who really wanted to establish a new institution, a physical institution with labs. And some of us stood out against that on the basis this had to be interdisciplinary. It had to be able to draw on the best of our terrific university ecosystem. And I think from what Jim said, you'll see that has been also amply vindicated. So it's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm now going to ask three members of the panel to join me for them to talk about the last 20 years and the future. So if Peter, Jim and Paul will all come up. I'm not going to give you introductions about them as such, because they're well known and they're all either former directors or co-directors or current co-directors of UKERC. So I don't think we could have a better group to take us through the past and the future. Thank you. Peter, you're going to kick us off.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. So it's my task to take you through some of the policy background over the last 20 years that UKERC has been operating in. And so I think that period has been one of unprecedented activity in respect of energy policy. So as we've heard, I think you can trace back a lot of what we're talking about now in terms of the energy transition and meeting long-term climate goals to that 2003 Energy White Paper, because that was the first time that the government had laid out this long-term ambition on climate change. And at that point, it's important to remember, and perhaps we easily forget, that at that time, renewables were less than 3% of electricity generation. And that paper saw increased renewables and improvements in energy efficiency as being really key to meeting that then 60% target for greenhouse gas emission reductions. Now, that was really the start of the process, and the next few years, as Joan has alluded to, there was quite a lot of discussion around actually the strategy outlined in that paper. And actually over those years, issues around energy security came a little bit more to the fore, and actually nuclear power, which the white paper had pretty much ruled out, came back onto the agenda. But of course, climate change hadn't gone away, and the UK's commitment to making those long-term reductions was embedded in legislation through the 2008 Climate Change Act. So that increased the target to an 80% reduction by 2050, while also creating the Climate Change Committee, the system of carbon budgets, and also for the first time, at the same time, brought together climate and energy in one department, the Department of Energy and Climate Change. Now, moving forward, 2010 saw a change in government. So the previous Labour administration was replaced by a coalition between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. But the focus on emission reductions continued. And despite some progress with decarbonising electricity, and by this time, certainly by 2013, renewables had increased to a 15% share of electricity generation, it was felt that actually we needed to restructure the policy environment if we were to push on with that decarbonisation process. So that 2013 Energy Act introduced a process of electricity market reform, which, as you will know, included long-term contracts to support low carbon generation, not only renewables, but also nuclear. And indeed, that's where we saw the building, or the starting of the building of the Hinkley Point nuclear reactor. Now, the next few years was a period of quite a lot of turmoil. In 2016, we had the Brexit decision to leave the EU. David Cameron resigned as Prime Minister, and the new Conservative government gave greater emphasis to linking climate change with economic and industrial development. And also, we, for the first time, saw offshore wind power becoming a really key renewable technology. And then later on, following the Paris Agreement, also the IPCC report on the 1.5 degree scenarios, the UK government decided to strengthen its climate target in 2019 and adopted the net zero target that we have today. And of course, there are a number of different policy publications that have been produced over the recent years. I'm just highlighting here the net zero report as being particularly important. And of course, as we know, in recent years, questions of energy security, of energy affordability have really come back onto the agenda as well. And so it's already been mentioned, but I think it's really interesting to see that actually that the creation of UKERC was embedded in some of those early policy processes. So as has been alluded to, Sir David King, who was the Chief Scientific Advisor, was asked by the government to undertake a review of Energy Research, Development and Demonstration, and he made the recommendation that there should be this energy research centre created, and that was reflected in the advice of the Performance and Innovation Unit report, which then helped to inform what was in the white paper. So as I say, UKERC is really sort of instrumental in that beginning of that energy transition. But of course, UKERC research has evolved over time to reflect that changing policy environment. And I just wanted to kind of reflect on some of the things that we've been doing that has addressed the challenges as they have come along. So in phase one, as Jim Ski said, I think the central question was really about how can we decarbonise the whole energy system. As Joan has said, there was quite a lot of scepticism, at least internationally, about whether that actually was possible. And so UKERC was addressing some of the key issues that needed to be tackled. So we had a TPA report on the cost and impacts of intermittency. As I say, at that time, renewables less than 3%. We wanted to scale that up, and we weren't sure, you know, is that going to be possible? What are the costs? What are the other impacts going to be? We also had a report looking at the rebound effect and trying to quantify that. As I've mentioned, a key leg of the 2003 white paper was energy efficiency. And again, there were questions around whether that potential could be realised or whether a lot of it would be taken back through rebound. And as Jim Ski mentioned, a lot of the UKERC work that was done in phase one was brought together in the Energy 2050 publication, which eventually became a book. Then move on 5 years. So we're now in 2009, the second phase of UKERC, and we've had the Climate Change Act of 2008. So we've now got an 80% target. And so the focus of UKERC really shifted to making it happen. What actually concretely do we need to do? So again, we were looking at things like transport. We developed a new transport model and ran scenarios for transport decarbonisation. We also addressed global issues. The report on the gas challenge there in the middle. And I think that is still worth reading, actually, in the light of what's happened more recently. And we continued to provide insight to policymakers. And so we had this insight publication, which drew on a number of different scenarios to provide advice to government about how to make it happen. Then again, in phase three, by this time we were into the transition, and a number of challenges and trade-offs I think were beginning to become apparent. And so UKERC was exploring those. So we were looking at the challenge of decarbonising heat, questions of path dependency. We were looking internationally to see good practice in that area and what we could learn from that. We were also considering the relationship between the energy system and broader sustainability concerns. So we had a report looking at energy scenarios and scenarios for ecosystem services as well. And we were considering different dimensions of government. So we were exploring the role of local actors and in particular of local authorities in delivering the energy transition. And now in the current phase, phase four, again, there are new challenges and opportunities that are arising from the geopolitical context which we're operating in. So we've looked at the implications of Brexit for decarbonisation. We've considered the role of public engagement and public attitudes. This report was around low carbon heating technologies. And we've also continued to respond to the policy environment and wider issues as they've developed. So the so-called Pot Zero report, which is the last one at the bottom there, that was looking at how in response to the increase in gas prices, we might change the wholesale market for electricity so to pass on to consumers the lower cost that exists with renewables and also nuclear power. So where does that leave us? Where are we today? So I think it's fair to say that actually, despite some of the noise, the energy transition continues to be embedded within legislation, most notably recently the Energy Act from last year. But it is also true to say, I think, that there is less political consensus now than perhaps there's been in the past, particularly around messaging, but also about some of the details on how we might implement the transition. And we're expecting a new government towards the end of this year. And no matter what political persuasion they are from, we need to accelerate delivery and implementation, and this will need to be a key challenge for them to meet, particularly if we're going to meet our shorter term climate goals. And of course, challenges remain. These encompass things, engineering, so we're now trying to completely decarbonize our energy system, our electricity system, which might be in some ways the most challenging area. There are still gaps in policy. In my own area, looking at industry, we don't really have a framework to deliver decarbonisation of dispersed sites. There are societal challenges, and our work looking at public engagement and opposition to large infrastructure projects, I think, is very important. There are economic challenges. We've seen cost pressures. We've seen high interest rates and how they affect investment decisions are going to be key going forward. And of course, there are geopolitical issues. Recently gas. But I think looking forward, we can see issues around supply chains, critical materials, a whole wide variety of things which lie outside of the UK. And so I think that, interesting. Okay, my last bullet point, which doesn't seem to want to come up, is to say that, there we go, that UKERC, we're proposing a new phase of work that will help to address some of those challenges. We're hoping to provide evidence, robust evidence, to tackle those and to really deliver the step change that we all know is needed. And with that thought, thank you very much.
Thank you. Super. Right.
So, hi everybody. Really nice to be back with you all. For some of you, I know lots of familiar faces, and really pleased to be asked to help celebrate UKERC's 20th anniversary. I was looking back through a lot of my files just to remind myself of how far we've come, and I did remember I was involved in some of the bids that predated Jim Ski. So there were 3 bids to establish UKERC. And the research councils didn't like any of them, so they brought in Jim as a sort of enforcer to bring bits of the tribes together and develop what became UKERC Phase 1 back in 2004. And while I was looking through, I couldn't resist reading this out, so I found my handover notes. So I took over from Jim in 2013 as research director initially, and then director. And lots of really well-written handover notes about how UKERC worked and what I needed to do with various things. But right at the bottom, there was a note on IT equipment that he donated to his successor. And I'm going to read this out. So I bequeath to whoever follows me an HP laptop whose screen is, insert expletive here, and which you can only refresh by squeezing hard with your thumb. The screen stays blank when you wakes up from standby. So that wasn't a very good start. A HP desktop whose password I can't remember, but which has helpfully popped up on my screen for 3 years. So maybe that was a bit more useful. And then a BlackBerry, so that really dates it, which now appears incapable of sending and receiving data. Might be an idea to cancel the contract, he says. But he did give me a fully functioning docking station for the laptop, a keyboard and a mouse. So, But despite that bequest, obviously I took over at a time when Jim had done an amazing job as the first research director, and I think it was a difficult act to follow, but in a way set things up really, really well for my time. And I'd really echo what Jim said. I really enjoyed it too. So on a slightly more serious note, or maybe it's not when you see the next slide, but when Rob asked me to speak, he said, can you find those slides of the Lego people you used to use? Some of you might remember this. So there was a Twitter feed, which has now, I think, been discontinued, called the Lego Academics, which I used to use in internal talks to UKERC, because I found that uncannily, whenever I was thinking about what was important on a particular general meeting, somebody had tweeted something which was relevant. So I've used these just to make really 3 points about UKERC and what makes it important. And actually, Nikki, some of the points you made are very similar to what I make. So I'm kind of reinforcing. So obviously, minds think alike on these things. And in a way, the Lego academics were business as usual. They were talking about things that they did badly or found difficult because of the way universities worked. And I think one of UKERC's key features, following a number of other research programs like it, is that it enabled academics to actually fix some of those problems. So actually to do things very differently. It may seem second nature now to have an interdisciplinary cross-UK research centre with lots of universities involved. That was really unusual back in 2004. I think there was a couple that had been the forerunners, the Tyndall Centre, which I was involved in, and a couple of other programs, but it was really still unusual. So this first one strongly encouraged to do cross-disciplinary research, except in, well, we somehow managed to find a structure which enabled us to do that. And I'd certainly reinforce some of the examples that have already been talked about. So I'd highlight, for example, our research on heat transitions over the last 10 years, if not more. And that really combined a whole range of different types of research. So yes, we need the models at national level, at local level, to understand the options and what's cheapest and how far and how fast can we go. But we also did work on public engagement, which has only just reached fruition over the last couple of years, but also on the role of organisations, you know, which organisations are involved. And our research then got quite political with a small p. I remember Richard Lowes, who is not a researcher with us anymore, he's moved on to another role now, but having quite a tough time to try and understand the actors in the heat decarbonisation space, because not everybody had the same view about what should be happening. And some interests had a lot of power and incumbency, and others were new and didn't have much power. So we researched that as well. So it brought together all those different perspectives. I think the second example I came across when looking through my files was an example of where government was asking for help, and we were able to bring together a whole set of different activities and expertise to do that. So I sat on the advisory group for Nick Hurd, who was at the time the Energy and Climate Minister, developing one of those documents Peter showed, the Clean Growth Plan. And through that, we were able to then provide a lot of evidence into that process of developing that strategy. So evidence on resource efficiency from John Barrett and his team, on intermittency again, because that issue has not gone away since we did the first report in UKERC, on finance and finance options and how finance works, again, a really salient topic still, and on the strategic advice of the whole picture. So again, this is a testament to, yes, it was me sitting there in the advisory group, but actually I could draw on this huge interdisciplinary expertise. So the second one I found was about collaboration. And again, you know, universities sometimes are good at this and sometimes not, as the picture indicates. But I think, again, UKERC's done very well. And again, Nikki's mentioned this a bit, but the forerunner of the networking fund, which you mentioned, Nikki, was something called the Meeting Place, which UKERC ran in the first couple of phases and into the third. And the original idea was of a bricks and mortar institution, rather like the debate that Joan alluded to. So I remember John Schellenhuber, my counterpart at the Tyndall Centre, he wanted this thing called a research hotel, he called it. And what he had in his mind is a university building a building so people can come and spend time in there to collaborate and so on. We did, I guess, a cheaper version, and, well, you can argue over effectiveness, but the Meeting Place was really, really important. It brought people together for a number of days at a time to discuss issues, not just academics, but stakeholders too. So, for example, it did a really, I think, insightful workshop back in 2013 about the future of the gas network. That is still something government and the industry, in my view, still hasn't got their head around what needs to be done, especially if that gas network needs to decline rapidly. But that was quite ahead of its time, that meeting. And then the second I'd pick out, which I remember in 2011, is just looking back, but not just looking back, it's the theme of today, but actually what can we learn from history for future transitions? How can we draw on the experience of technology change or whole system change in energy and then apply that to how we look at the future? So that was important too. So that was UKERC really convening the wider community. And then the third one is about international research. I mean, this again is dated because of the reference to Skype, I think. That's definitely pre-pandemic. But international collaboration, as Nikki mentioned, has always been important for UKERC. So it was a founding member, going back to the reference to Japan that Joan made, of the UK-China collaboration on low-carbon societies. That collaboration still goes. It brought in a number of other countries in Europe and their research centres and a number of others around the world. And those meetings have been really important for collaboration beyond our immediate neighbourhood in Europe. And that's an important example. But the second is one that I'm still involved in, which is the European Energy Research Alliance. We were found a member of that alliance back in 2008. It's just celebrated its 15th anniversary. That's really gone from strength to strength and brings together the leading research institutes across Europe. And they've been very, very kind to us through our political difficulties with the Brexit referendum, etc. They kept us involved, and now we're a full member again, thank goodness, with the Horizon Europe programme, so we can now participate fully in that whole institution, which is about both collaborating for grants, of course, that's why academics want to get together, but actually having a voice in the discussions in Brussels, which are like the discussions in the UK, going to undergo some pretty radical changes this year with elections ahead and everything else. So that's, I think, a really, really important thing that UKERC needs to continue doing, and a good example of that. So I'll stop there, but as I said, it's a massive pleasure to be here, and I think UKERC hopefully will build on those foundations and go from strength to strength in the future.
Paul, you've heard about the past and the present. Would you like to comment on how that positions us for the future up to 2050, where, you know, some of us feel there will be no future unless we hit net zero?
Yeah, well, I'm certainly in that camp, and thank you very much, Joan. I have no slides, so I'll stay where I am, if that's all right. There are three things we need to do in the future. We've got to cut emissions drastically and get carbon removals going at scale. That will determine, if we do that globally, that will determine what the climate adaptation requirements are. And I often feel with the adaptation debate that we don't recognise that the amount of adaptation we'll need depends on the extent to which we are successful in that first objective. And we've got to hope for the best on the climate damages. I mean, we're all aware of this exceptional heating period we've been through over the last year. As far as I'm aware, the climate science is still out as to whether that's exceptional and has been reinforced by El Niño and will therefore subside during this year, or whether actually we're in a period of new normal, which is particularly worrying. So before I just elaborate briefly on some of that, I too want to look back a bit, but only really to 2009 and the years before that. And firstly, I want to say, Joan, with your characteristic modesty, you didn't highlight the really important role you played in DTI at the time, because you were facing headwinds not just incomprehension from other civil servants, both in this country and abroad, but also a real academic debate as to what should be done, whether we should get into industrial strategy, as picking winners is now called. And I remember on your Sustainable Energy Policy Advisory Board, which you convened to give governmental advice, we had some real arguments on that, academic arguments about, you know, government, if it tried to pick winners, it got them all wrong. And the fact that we have offshore wind at the level we now have it was largely because, I'm pleased to say I was arguing in favour of that kind of support, but without your support at the DTI, I don't think that would have come through. So that's quite important. And it's important that we recognise just how successful that's been, because at 2009, in that book that was put up there on the Energy 2050 thing, it was just after the Climate Change Act, and the unbelievably ambitious target for 2020 was a 32% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2020. Well, we know we got to 49% by 2020, and we've gone over 50% since then. So actually we can do it. Even when we've had these very stretching targets, we beat it, not just, we beat it by a mile. We've got to do the same with a whole range of other challenges, which I'm sure UKERC is going to be really influential in pushing forward. We've got to get this grid integration stuff sorted out, or we're not going to be able to build out the rest of the power system that we need. We've got to do storage, we've got to do heat decarbonisation. I mean, the other huge success story was electric vehicles, which we weren't even thinking of at that time as a real replacement for the internal combustion engine. I remember when I was at Imperial College at the end of the 60s, there was one venerable professor who was a standing joke because he had an electric vehicle in the basement. And every weekend he came to work on this electric vehicle, which we callous engineering students all thought was completely bonkers, because this had been around for so many years and had never gone anywhere. And yet now here we are with the IEA saying very recently, its most recent electric vehicle forecasts, that something like 2/3 of all new vehicles will be electric between 2030 and 2035 on the basis of current market trends. But there's still lots of very slow progress, because in those 2009 scenarios in Energy 2050, there was lots of CCS, there was lots of BECCS. We hadn't really begun to think seriously about removals apart from BECCS, but we realized we would also have to slow deforestation, and we would have to somehow think about agriculture and its contribution to greenhouse gases. And to be honest, we've made very little progress with any of that stuff. And we now need to do with those sectors what we've managed to do with the power sector and offshore wind. On the damages side, many of you will be aware of the recent paper in Nature that was saying going through 2 degrees is likely to knock something like 20% off global income by 2050, which is an extraordinary throwback to the Stern Review in 2007, which also said 20% off global income. And of course, at the time, the environmental economics establishment, led by people like Bill Nordhaus, who subsequently went on to win a Nobel Prize, were saying that this was complete nonsense, and that actually the optimal global heating was 4 degrees, according to his very influential DICE model. So the tide has moved very much in that direction. And most recently, very positively, I spent much of the last 2 days on a video conference with the Coalition of Finance Ministers. This is a body, some 75 countries have pitched in there. And these are the guys who, right back in the early 2000s, we were saying, where's the Treasury? Why is the Treasury not involved in this stuff? Well, through this coalition, they are. They're 20 years late, but they are now engaged. And there was a whole range of both developing, emerging, and developed countries engaged there. The UK Treasury I didn't see, and I was disappointed not to see that. But the US was heavily engaged, the Australians were heavily engaged, etc. And my last point really is, forgive me some special pleading if you like, as an economist, the 2 things that keep me really, that I think are really important that we keep an eye on. First is this language around cost and investment, because we know that the climate delayers are not deniers anymore, because that's quite impossible, but they are delayers because they say it's too expensive, because they don't understand the difference between cost and investment. And again, fantastic recent IEA report that showed that 1/3 of the growth in the 4 major economic blocs in the world, China, India, US, and EU, 1/3 of the growth has been delivered by the clean energy sector, which, considering its size in the economy overall, is simply extraordinary. So I don't want to hear anything about cost coming up on this, because it simply plays into that narrative of we can't afford it. And in the light of the upcoming damages, that would be the worst possible economic decision to take. But we also need to keep an eye on financial stability. And this was a major theme in this Coalition of Finance Ministers meeting, that it will be a very fine line to engineer the growth of the clean energy sector fast enough to reduce the climate damages, but to allow the fossil fuel industry, which is the biggest, richest, and most powerful industry that the world has ever known, to allow that to decline in such a way that it doesn't cause major financial instability. And I don't think we've yet got that right. So,
Thank you. Actually, I want to put this question to the panel. We have 1 or 2 questions to the panel. If this time we might have 1 or 2 from the floor, but we'll see how we go. It's around this growth piece and contrasting what you've just said about the lack of understanding with the way we had the debate on CPAP in the early 2000s. And looking at that wealth of evidence and the reports, I mean, what do you think UKERC can or should be doing now to try to nail this myth? Is it further research? Is it more communication? And is there anything that can be pulled off the shelf and put into the debate in a pre-election period where it all seems to be about avoiding any cost, if I can put it that way. So, Jim, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, I mean, I defer to Paul on the sort of macroeconomic evidence, so you put that really, really well, I think. And I think the only thing I'd add is that some of the what is sometimes called non-orthodox economic evidence really emphasizes that point about investment leading to increasing returns and these non-linear changes of the kind we've seen with the growth of some renewables, the growth of electric vehicles now. And orthodox economics just finds it very, very hard to deal with that. So there is something about the kind of economic framework, you know, some of the decision makers might be using. But I think the other thing which is important, and I remember, you know, UKERC has done some work on this, and I'd really encourage UKERC to keep working on this and providing evidence, whether it's new or just communicating, just to complement this aggregate picture, which really doesn't speak to people, you know, very well. It speaks to the overall picture, you know, this amount of GDP could be saved, or, you know, as you said, a third of the growth is from the clean energy sector, that's fine. But then what does that mean in terms of, you know, things like household bills and distributional effects and so on and so forth? I mean, it's something we used to engage with government about quite a lot, is to say, look, you really need to look across your policies to how you're going to meet, you know, the next carbon budget, say, and then do an aggregate analysis of how it's going to affect income deciles 1 to 10. And I'm sure some of that thinking is there, but it's certainly not there and communicated. And I'd encourage UKERC to build on the really good work it's done in the past on that and the present to bring, you know, it's almost a complement to that kind of more high-level aggregate picture that you get on the growth story.
Yeah. Peter?
Yeah, I mean, I would reflect, sort of focusing on my own area of research around industry at the moment, that I think one of the challenges is that while government has an industrial decarbonisation strategy, it doesn't actually have a broader industrial strategy. So, and I think that that's, you know, in terms of thinking about growth and about economic performance and about wealth for the country, you know, that is a yawning gap at the moment. And I think that it makes it quite difficult then when you only see kind of intervention through the lens of decarbonisation. You can't fit that within a bigger picture about what is our ambition for the industrial sector in the UK, and how can we harness both the growth of that sector, you know, where do we see our competitive advantage, and at the same time, how can we make sure that that, you know, is done in a clean way. And at the moment, we're just focusing on the kind of the decarbonisation bit, as I say, without that industrial strategy bit. And I think that's an important thing that UKERC, again, can provide some evidence on.
Paul, do you want to add anything further?
Well, I think I've more or less shot my bolt on that, and I very much agree with what Jim and Peter said. I think that's a battle which is being won in government, which is the need for industrial strategy. And any sort of perception as to how one is going to reshape the energy system so that it does contribute to macroeconomic performance will require smart industrial strategy. And I think the debate has moved on so much from that, from the kind of contemptuous government picking winners stuff, which I now very rarely hear. And one of the themes that came through again and again from the Coalition of Finance Ministers meeting yesterday was, this is the new competitive terrain. And the countries that really do this stuff well will be the countries that are actually in the lead. And that with the evidence from the IEA, and I think UKERC, perhaps if there's a new phase, could think of, I mean, there won't be money because the bid has gone in, can think of trying to involve that economic debate more centrally to its work than I think it has done in the past.
If I can abuse my position as moderator, I'd add one other point actually, and it picks up on your remarks, Paul, about the fossil fuel industry. There was a very interesting piece about some analysis in the US about the power of incumbency and how much that uses its wealth to influence policy, but linking that to the dampening effect it had on innovation and competitiveness, which, by the way, is what incumbents are trying to prevent, is more competition. So I think there's another message there, just to add to what you've all been saying. Just one further question, and that is, I mean, from the time of the white paper and everything anyone said in the last couple of decades, IEA, whoever, UKERC, a lot of the work being done in UKERC, is the underplaying of the role of energy demand in containing emissions, the role of energy efficiency, even if there's a rebound effect in helping with affordability in particular, possibly reliability, price volatility, all of that. I mean, is there any, what is there that we can be sharing more generally that actually could help us to get through that bottleneck? And as it's largely an economic question, do you want to go first this time, Paul?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure actually that it is a largely economic question. I think it's very much a largely behavioural question. I've been fascinated.
Behavioural economics.
Well, obviously behavioural economics, but not just behavioural economics. I've been fascinated by the links in my mind between tobacco and other health harming issues and fossil fuels, because fossil fuels are extremely health harming. And the whole, I've been involved in the Lancet Countdown for the last 7 or 8 years, and it's quite clear that the links between health and fossil fuel consumption are very, very strong, even leaving global warming out of it. But with global warming, it becomes absolutely essential. And it's been fascinating listening to the political debates that are actually going to prevent people who are now 14 from ever buying cigarettes, which is a real intervention in behaviours on the grounds of health, even when it's their own health they're harming, whereas we know that fossil fuel users actually harm the health of everybody globally through the emissions that they emit. And I just wonder, therefore, whether it might be possible at some point in the future for that demand question for fossil fuels. I don't think anyone's quibbling with demand for energy, though obviously renewable energy, the less we need in order to decarbonise, the better. Whether that could be a determining argument in the politics of behaviour change, which we're seeing, and that debate in the House of Commons was absolutely fascinating, between individual choice to kill yourself if you want to, between actually thinking about effects on the community, effects on the health service, and all that other kind of stuff. Very, very interesting. And a lot of those arguments can be, climate change and fossil fuel use can be framed in that way.
Thank you. Peter?
Yeah, I mean, picking up what Paul said, I actually think there is a strong case for reducing all energy use, just because it means that the amount of supply infrastructure that we need will be so much less. I mean, we were discussing yesterday at the parliamentary reception that we held, about the challenge of building out the infrastructure that we will need, about the massive increase in electricity generation that will be needed to 2050. And if one can moderate that, then obviously you need less power lines and therefore you face less opposition. If we think about the role of critical materials and the extent to which the supply of those may be in question as we move forward, then I think if we just make the whole of the energy system smaller by reducing demand, we actually reduce problems on so many fronts. And I think it is the one glaring gap currently in the way that we are thinking about delivering net zero, that we're just not giving enough attention to the demand side and moving that debate beyond just purely about energy efficiency to a more holistic discussion around reducing energy demand.
Thank you. Jim?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously agree that there's a huge argument for doing more on the demand side. We are in a particular period where, in terms of policy salience, demand side action is quite low down the agenda. for this government. I was talking to a nameless civil servant last night, and they admitted as much. It was very hard to get anything through at the moment on that. And this isn't really a party political point. There's a really good paper by Nick Eyre and Jan Rasnow. Nick was a co-director at UKERC, and Jan was with us as well, looking back at energy efficiency policy, and it has gone up and down in salience, and sometimes in surprising ways in sync with different parties. So it's not a party political point. But I do find myself having to remind audiences of civil servants and sometimes politicians that we weren't once very good at this, and it isn't that long ago that we had a very effective, say, home energy efficiency program until about 2012. Decisions were made and then it fell off a cliff. So it's partly a reminder that it is possible, because I think it's, because it's been 10 years, there's a lot of forgetting, and there's a lot of people thinking, oh, this is very difficult, so we just won't go there. And I think a reminder that it's possible. And then the second thing I'd say is that if you look at the international evidence now about what other countries are doing, I'd mention Ireland and Germany and France. There's a really nice report by Green Alliance on this, saying this is how you help particularly households, taking them through a journey, combining it with finance, thinking about people's ability to pay, giving them all the advice rather than leaving them with lots of tradespeople they have to try and coordinate and then they give up. Lots and lots of really good examples of how to do this well, which an incoming government could do well to look at, learn from, and act on.
Thank you. Sadly, we have run out of time, so there won't be an opportunity for questions from the floor now, but we'll all be around, and there'll be lots of chance to have exchanges at lunchtime. I think there's one additional point on this reduction of demand, which is that would actually take away one of the alibis of the fossil fuel industry, which is they're supplying a legitimate product. And the demand is there, and therefore they've got to carry on, regardless of the evidence about what's already coming down the track in terms of supply. But I think just the main theme that's coming out for me from this session and Nicola's introduction is just how rich the contribution of UKERC has been. And if I were granted a magic wand, it would be to wave it and have that body of evidence, both now and what's to come, make more impact and actually be understood, help with raising public understanding, but also influencing policymakers, many of whom actually do want to do the right thing, not all of them, or they do the right thing but within a rather peculiar mindset, if I can put it neutrally. I think if only we could actually get that more prominent in the discourse, I think that could help enormously on the ambition to tackle this huge problem, not just of emissions reduction, but the associated problems of the impacts and adaptation and the over exposure of the vulnerable countries. So with that, I'd like you to join me in just thanking the panel for a really interesting session.